Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today is February 12th, and we're going to start with roll call. If everyone could just be reminded that this is being recorded, and that when you speak, please just make sure that your mic is green. And if we could just start with the mayor, please, and go around for roll call. Here.
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 Gary Carter, Director of Economic Development.
Here.
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 And I should have been more specific to state the name. I'm sorry, guys. But everyone is here, minus we do not have Trip Straub.
So in front of you is a copy of the agenda and also a copy of the January minute meetings. So the next item on the agenda is the consideration of the minutes. I hopefully had sent those out in advance. So if anyone has any changes, please let me know.
I move to accept the minutes as provided.
I second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Minutes are approved. Next, so the majority of our time today is going to be spent on going over the information that we talked about, we wish we had, we didn't know we had, or we wanted to see last time. So I'm just going to start with that, and feel free to interrupt with any questions as we move through. I think we're going to hit all the topics that we did discuss last time, so. One of the things that was mentioned last time is in the Clayton Tomorrow 2040 plan, we used Placer ID. I think I talked about that last time. That is software embedded somewhere in one of your apps on your phone that allows this company to track our movement. It's one of those things I think we all blindly accept when we download an app, but it was used here in Clayton for this plan. It kind of did the baseline of 2019 and then looked at 2023. So this is now almost 3 years old. So I don't, I think a majority of it still remains relevant, but I think we are experiencing a change, particularly with the office and the occupancy, because in 2023, I think it suggests that we had a lot of leased space in Clayton that wasn't necessarily occupied. And now those leases are starting to roll through. So I'm not sure. I think the numbers of occupancy probably have increased a little bit, but they're still probably not at the 2019 number. So just keep the dates of this stuff in mind as we go through this. So you can see, particularly with our office density, how that was impacted through the pandemic, especially, with these examples here. The enterprise headquarters was 55% down, Centene Plaza 58% down, and the Pierre Laclede building representing multiple businesses was 60. And I don't know if Julie or Amr would want to comment on this, but I mean, it certainly impacted the lunch crowd in Clayton.
Yes.
Oddly enough, the hotels were not greatly impacted. As you can see, there was only a 5% variance at the Ritz-Carlton. Traffic at the Seven Gables actually increased. So there was a lot of movement. They just weren't necessarily going into the office. And then covering some of the dining, some of the neighborhood anchors, as it called itself, the Caldi's and the Bow, in 2023 were 90% recovered. But again, highlighting the lunch depreciation during that time period. really took a hit, and I don't know, Amr, if you want to comment about where it is today or not.
Well, seeing a little wave, last year, our lunch was almost 20% increase. The year before last year, it continues to go and increase. And this year, we took a dip starting and we're coming right back. So 2023 and 2024 were going down. 2025 was over 25%.
Up. And then this year is down?
Started down in January, the last
Okay.
week of January, you know why.
Yes.
We lost over $45,000 in 4 days.
Because of the snow.
Revenue. Because, yeah, if you look at the reservations we had on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I estimated in my books of about $45,000. It's a suggestion to Gary that we do, I called it a makeup weekend for Restaurant Week, but that did not work.
We're going to come back to that later in the presentation. So the visitor profile, part of those people coming into town here, you can see that they're relatively affluent. Spending power of those people coming in, kind of bolstered, what economy that we had left coming out of the pandemic. Yeah, sorry. Yep, sorry about that.
But Gary, if I may add one thing really quick that I noticed in the last 8 months, I should say, due to all the businesses that moved in the next building, Valley Buildings in Parkside, you have Enterprise, you have all these companies that came flocking into that building, increased the traffic around that area tremendously. Walking distance, a lot of young professionals talk a lot with.
You mean traffic in a good sense then? Okay.
Yes. The young professional into that building, it makes a lot of difference. And especially with lunch, happy hour, or sometimes early dinners, Steve Gottram and I speak about that quite a bit. And professional people coming in and out. It's one thing that Clayton probably did a job last year on, area more. These buildings have empty for pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Or you open lunch and nobody's coming because half of the offices are empty. And now a lot of the companies are requiring everybody to attend the office. Like the Hoffman building, Parkside, Enterprise, they won't let people work from home anymore.
Yeah, I think there's a big transition going on. I think initially it was you have to be in the office one day, and then it was 2 days, and it was 3 days, and I think it's
Companies realize that productivity is the thing.
yeah. So that kind of covers the traffic patterns. The next topic that was requested at last month's meeting was more detail on the special district budget itself. So what I've done here, and just as a reminder, I've been putting this is just summary that we're going through here. All of this information in its original format is also on the share drive that I've been sharing with you also. So if you ever have a desire to go into that information, you can see more of the detail. But so I've put the budget from 22 to 26 in here. Not a lot of the categories really change. Not a lot of the amount of money changes in the different categories, with the exception of personnel, which always has increases over time. Most of the other categories have stayed relatively constant throughout the years. Again, most of the money going to personnel and special events. And then the event staff time is also those special events too. Some of the categories come and go. Professional studies, we've paid for parking studies, housing studies over the course of the years also.
Gary, can I ask you a question regarding the events? What events exactly are within this budget?
We're going to come to that in just a
Okay.
minute. This next slide here is the fund balance or what is not spent at the end of each year and carries over cumulatively. You can see currently we're holding about a $77,000 reserve at this time. So these are the events that, with one caveat that I'll get to in just a minute. These are the events that are funded out of the Special Business District. So there is the Music and Wine, the Clayton Jazz Festival, Clayton Restaurant Week, of which there are two. There's a summer edition, and then there's also a winter edition. The city is a sponsor of the art fair, which takes place in downtown. Last couple of years, we've started a new event called Day of the Dead. In the past, we attempted a event called Open Streets that's no longer on the rotation. Then art fair meals, those are the meals that we provide to our staff while on duty that weekend. In the past, we were sponsors of the Clayton Chamber of Commerce's Parties in the Park. That organization ceased to exist, so that expense is no longer in there. And in the past, we've done several events related to the St. Louis sports teams, like the soccer team, the Cardinals home opener, and the Blues home opener. Those are no longer in the program, albeit as I was going through this information, the Cardinals home opener somehow got missed in communications in the budget and was actually included in that, but that is a mistake. And then the equipment line is, we have a trailer, a large trailer, and it is full of 2 generators, folding chairs, cocktail tables, round tables that we use for our event, so we don't keep incurring that cost. And then the IFE membership is part of the staff that I'm responsible for is a special events coordinator. And the IFE is a national organization for events. So does that answer your question, Julie?
Yeah.
Mhm.
When I was looking over.
Mhm.
Just, why did you decide to continue?
Events are a hard thing. And so that was the first year for it. And then it was also weather related also. So we've had that now a couple times with different events, and we don't necessarily want to base anything off a 1-year trial, especially being outside. If I held the event inside the Ritz-Carlton Ballroom and no one showed up, I don't think I have an issue unless there's 9 inches of snow on the streets. So, and the way this usually works is in a couple months, staff will be doing a presentation to the mayor and city council about the event plan and kind of get their input and their direction on what events they would like to see if they've no longer thought a particular one was serving its purpose. Mhm.
I think the event itself is a good event. They just had a couple of bad luck with weather. They're on Brentwood, and I watched the first year between being 40 degrees and cloudy and the wind gust that literally took the tent away. People just didn't care to go out there and listen to think. But the actual event, I think, could be successful if they get a lucky weekend or a lucky day of nice weather like the wine and jazz last year. It was absolutely perfect. So that's my opinion of that event.
And we learn a lot as we go through the process also. And then, Almer was pointing out that this year that we had the snow event during the restaurant week. And the way it was programmed and the way funds were expended, we just did not have the logistics in place to extend it another weekend, albeit some restaurants extended it themselves. So we're taking that advice and incorporating that into next fiscal year's plan to have a contingency in case we do need to move stuff. Some of the larger events, that's very difficult. Some of the things we can postpone delivery of equipment. But as we're going through the warmer months like music and wine, we are renting generators, we are renting stages and such things like that. And if we miss our weekend, they may or may not be booked for the redo date. So we're exploring those possibilities with our vendors now about how we can ensure that we can continue to have the event even if it rains us out on the first day.
I may, I think it would be a good idea when you spend the money on the advertisement part, such as Channel 5, for instance, aired this restaurant week for 5 days, and everybody watched it. Everybody talked about how Channel 5 talking about event. And if they can add a blurb into the advertisement, of course, they're going to know the weather's going to be bad on Saturday, on Thursday. When they're talking, you can say something like, if the weather is bad and we get a lot of snow, the Clayton City is looking to do this the following week. So you can kind of save some of that advertisement we're talking about.
Yeah, and I agree, Amr. We are, not only are we revisiting how we program these for cancellation or postponements, not easy for me to say, but also incorporating a new strategy on the communications about the events too.
Yeah,
So.
because people, when they cancel or when they call us and say, sorry, we canceled, the weather's bad, they're asking, is the city going to do this next week? We don't know. So if the advertisement announces that ahead, so we know that's going to happen the following or maybe a week from now.
Yeah, I think it's a broader conversation we can have at another time because I think there's, you also don't want to send mixed messages. You could come this week, but you might be able to come next week. You know what I mean? And you don't want to drive people away from the actual event time in case that you don't need to make it up too. So, unfortunately with events outside or weather dependent and timing, it is luck of the draw 9 times out of 10.
Hey, Gary, can I just ask, under fiscal year 24, is that a typo, the Parties in the Park 65,000 and the St. Louis City 36,000? It seems incredibly high.
That is a typo.
Okay,
Thank
yeah.
you. There's no way that's
Yeah.
correct.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the Parties in the Park sponsorship was always $5,000. The FC event would fluctuate, but it fluctuate around 7,000.
Right.
So it
yeah.
didn't fluctuate another 29.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
figured.
sorry.
I just wanted to make sure
That
everybody
is,
knew that we
thank
didn't,
you.
that we didn't, make a big donation to,
No, we did not.
Did Party in the Park happen in 2025? Stopped at 24.
I can't remember.
Yeah, I must have shifted some columns at this, but
It's 24.
yeah,
We-
24 was the last event for that.
Get these numbers here. Gary, these are adopted numbers though, right?
Yeah,
These aren't the actual. So I think what happened was we had budgeted for it. I think they actually shuttered after we had put the budget together. So you got through the Parties in the Park events that were held in 24. Our budget's adopted and goes into effect on October 1st of 24. Then they shuttered and that money had already been programmed. So I think it was in the adopted budget, but just not spent that particular year
Right.
because the event no longer occurred. What that would have done is hit that
Fund balance.
$77,000 fund balance that Gary was talking about. That's basically the reserve, correct? 77 of the 77,000, I would assume that 5,000 of that is Parties in the Park money that wasn't spent.
and so this next slide just shows you how the events change from year to year, or if they're added, how it's affecting the budget. But I mean, generally, we, like you as individuals, experience inflation on our materials and goods, rentals of Johnny on the spots, electrical, and so forth. So it is subject, just like everything else, the growing inflation. Yes. So earlier I mentioned how the city council, the staff would do a presentation to the city council. These are the city council goals as adopted as of 23. David, do you remember? 23, 24? Yeah, somewhere in that time frame. And these get adjusted every 5-7 years, probably, in my history. So these are the things that we keep in mind as we develop new events. Relatively straightforward, trying to develop a civic pride. Since we are using special district funds, it is, everything is made in an attempt to spotlight the local businesses in the special business district, because it is those real estate taxes that create that fund. Trying to create vibrancy. We use that word ad nauseum around here at the city, until we find a better word. I think we'll continue to use it. But, just trying to create that activity, especially after hours, work hours. Promote diversity and a sense of welcoming in Clayton, and encourage activity, accessibility, and a healthy environment in Clayton. The next thing that was asked for last time was kind of a snapshot of what's going on in our different real estate markets. So this is information related to the Clayton office market. We are currently, can I move this, Myron, without? Recovering from the pandemic. I can tell you that Clayton has and always has been the kind of the leader in the region as far as office space goes, as far as both the Class A inventory, which is the modern, newer buildings, and the occupancy thereof. And you just see the bumps as it goes along here. Those, especially the blue line, those are when the new buildings come online. That's the inventory line. And then the occupancy is slow to follow after that with the lease ups. So this is how the buildings are getting leased up compared to the asking rent. And again, Clayton is usually the one that sets the bar for asking rents in the St. Louis region.
Gary, when going to that asking rent, was that current or was that dating back to 2023 as well?
So this starts, the left hand starts at 2000.
I
and
see
then-
that now.
And
to
then goes
26.
through.
Okay.
So I pulled this late January. So this is of late January of this year. And this is office, so it's not retail. So we're hovering around 13% vacancy right now, which is again leader in the area, a little bit higher than what it was in 2019, I believe. Rents are starting to creep up now as more occupancy occurs. Talking about the availability of space. So our last office building was the Commerce and Forsyth Tower down the street. So generally our space doesn't change much unless there would be a conversion of one of the older office buildings to residential or construction of a new office building. Obviously, we currently have no office space under construction or at this point in time, with the exception of single users under consideration. Moving on to our multifamily market, this is going to show you the net absorption or how people are using it against the asking rent and the effective rent, what they're actually getting compared to what they're asking for. It kind of changes dramatically as new product comes online. So currently, we are in the ramp-up process for the project across the street here, Bemiston Place, as they begin to lease up. There is also another apartment building on Merrimack that's under construction, so that line's going to jump again when that comes online. But to my knowledge, we are one of the higher per square foot in the Midwest, almost outside of Chicago, on a rental basis. So.
Gary, can you just explain the asking rent, effective rent, but can you kind of explain what net absorption means? I mean, does that just mean like how many people then are living there, like the percent? I just don't know exactly what.
The amount of space that's being taken down
Okay.
as it becomes available.
Okay.
And you can see again, the spikes in this are really as the inventory comes online, the vacancy spikes until it's leased out. So. And even with the number, even with the number being built and what you see is some fairly healthy rents per square foot. I think Anna, who's in the back there, and I take inquiries about new apartment buildings all the time. So I don't think we've reached our capacity for rental units in downtown Clayton particularly. So the next slide here is talking about vacant retail. And this one's a little bit different format because this is the inventory list that I keep myself. So this is fairly current as of last month with everything that was available. We're currently looking at 43,000 square feet of vacant space in the special business district of all the retail space. A lot of it is in some of the newer buildings. The 9 North Bemiston is the apartment building I just referenced across the street. Excuse me, the 77 Forsyth is the Centene property.
I just had a quick question. So are these like multiple like units just combined? So like could these like, on Bemiston, would that be like just one unit vacancy or there's like two?
Yeah, so the vacant ground floor space is the total vacant space in that address. And then the max contiguous space is the largest space in that building that you could use for one thing. So a lot of them are the exact same numbers. I think I think they're all the same with the exception of the very bottom, which is 16,000 square feet, but the largest single space is 8,000 square feet.
Is there a possibility for these to be subdivided into multiple rental spaces, or is this just kind of like that's?
Yeah, I think there definitely is.
Okay.
It just yeah, it depends on the
Right.
location. Like I know like the 9 North Bemiston or the Bemiston location across the street, there are Central Avenue spaces can be combined or devised into smaller spaces.
Okay.
Next, moving on to the hotel market. What this is all, so there's occupancy, ADR, average daily rate is what that stands for. And the RevPAR is a term in the hotel industry, meaning revenue um, for each room. And you can see we are currently at $128. That is all the hotels combined in Clayton. Plus, I'm going to caveat this because the database I use called CoStar will not subdivide hotel markets under a certain amount. So I think it was 5, 7, something like that. So if I try to search just on Clayton, it won't give me any information. So I do have to go out. So we're capturing like the hotel in Richmond Heights at the corner of Clayton Road and Brentwood. And I think the one that was also over at Hanley in 64 to over there behind Red Robin. I can't think of which flag that is, but
It's a Holiday Inn.
okay. This is just summarizing a little bit more of the hotel information, but I think at the end of the day, what it's suggesting is that we do still have a fairly healthy hotel market.
Do you have access to hotel basis or monthly basis, or you don't?
Not on an individual hotel basis. There is a database for that, but it's
The reason I'm asking is it helps a lot, especially most businesses around here. When the hotels are full, you can plan ahead of how you can fill the amount of people that they come in. I used to have a relationship with all these hotels where we can have a meeting once a month. And we'll send you email to say, this weekend we're 100% occupied. This weekend we're only 20% occupied. On that part, because we do get a lot of business clients from all these hotels. And the hotels usually recommend a lot of the restaurants and outlets in Clayton for the dining if they don't have a program. Those are the one we like the most. People that do a good job at that is the hotel on Forsyth, across from Bank of America. Is that a Renaissance?
oh, Residence Inn.
Residence Inn, yes.
Yeah.
Their communication is amazing. They're just on top of things when it comes to.
Good.
I can tell you any time, any week, anytime, what's their occupancy? Everybody's going.
They communicate that to you.
Absolutely. And so is the hotel on Mermack further down.
Oh, the Hampton.
Hampton.
Yes, the Hampton. The Meridian does a little, some of the people, they do care, some of them don't. Nothing worse than to have a bunch of people standing in the lobby going, where should we go eat? Like, what do you mean? Where's your concierge? Where's your front desk people? Keep that, we keep in touch with those people.
Good.
Okay, for instance, Monday, I knew there was a group came in for a conference, a Japanese group. Stayed in the 3 hotels. I had a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. All I had to do is give the concierge, the front managers, information that, hey, we can take care of these people if you send them over. And a lot of them didn't have any plan.
Did they tell me you're the only restaurant in
No,
town? If they
no,
came-
no.
They came all 3 days in a row.
Well, the first day, 6 of them. When they called back and said, we like it, we like to bring 15 people. I said, okay.
Great.
Wednesday, they brought 10, so.
That's right, I went in there. Talking, because I'm gonna go to. They. And the first. Book, you know. So, but we should do that because you know, by the town, we always talk to the concierge and say, what's good around here?
Well, it's,
And Hampton Inn, I've been there, and before I've talked to the manager there, and because
I totally agree with you.
And we have, and I can't see that from here, obviously, Kathy, I'm not sure I could see it. I'm not sure if I could see it if you put it in front of my face either, but, we have in the past produced something and that kind of looks like a bootleg version of that, to be honest with you, from here. We have put certain maps on our, website over the years and we did do maps of like restaurants and hotels and stuff like that. It's just, it became very time consuming to try to keep up with the locations and everything. And then with the advent of the smartphone, you know, there was kind of the dilemma of how much that's needed nowadays because, you know, I think it's great that people go to the concierge at the Residence Inn and ask, but I myself have, when I'm traveling, I never do that. I just open my phone and.
Well, I think,
we had some friends who were tornadoed.
you do a good job with their staff. They do.
Special events that are going on around. Have asked, they just.
I think, I don't know how would you feel about this, but I think the Clayton City should have an event for hotel concierges and business together. Where I did this for 2 years, where I invited all the concierge in the front desk and I did a happy hour for them. You can't, you know, just to know who you are, and we have a couple cocktails together. Here's our menu, you know, and get all the restaurants involved and all the hotels involved. The intermingling, you know, you compliment the hotel compliment the restaurant back. So the certain people that come to the restaurant from the front desk or concierge always will recommend a certain restaurant.
I think that's a great idea, and I think it would even be a better idea if you find a restaurateur who's willing to host it, because I think there's a big difference between inviting a group like that to Oceano or
You should have it.
somewhere like that,
You should
as
ro-
opposed to coming in this room.
you should
We lose a lot when we come in this room.
You
for
should
that.
rotate that to every single restaurant that's willing to participate. I mean, if you want to bring 150 people to my restaurants from 2 to 5, I'll be more than happy to do it for you. I'm sure Julie would do the same thing. Napoli would do the same, just to let
Yeah.
people know what you have.
That-
All these concierge front desk people, like Kathy said, when somebody talks to them, they freeze. Here's a piece of paper. Why don't you talk to me? Tell me something about your city. So we educate these people,
Mhm.
promote the city, promote.
You have the GMs there also.
Yes, I mean,
Okay.
the gal that's opened that little coffee shop down, what's that Colombian coffee? Zenzi, I can't even pronounce it. The place is great, but the place is struggling. So I went in there a couple of times and I talked to the lady who's in charge in there. And I said, you need to put the word out. You need to go out in the street and hand people cups of coffee. So they know who you are. Yesterday I walked by in the morning and she had a table. Here's taste coffee, here's taste of cake. You know, and this is the only way you can get people to understand who you are. The hotels are a big deal in Clayton. We have a lot of hotel rooms in here. And where these people are going, we don't know. When a customer comes to my restaurant, sits at the bar and he eats dinner, he's staying here at the Ritz for 5 days. And he says, I ate in the West End. I went down to some steakhouse in Kirkwood. I said, who told you all this? We have the best steakhouse. We have the best restaurants here in Clayton. He goes, well, you know what? I didn't know much. I just went through the Google stuff.
Mhm.
Go online and say, where can I go eat at a good steak restaurant? Chris's. He's going to drive to Limburg. Yeah, I mean, this is the things that it irritates me. People don't have the ambitious to go get the business, basically. Business is here. When Ritz-Carlton is 80% occupied, I want to know what everybody doing when they're free, not when they're in meeting, not when they're in conference. They're going to have a free days here and there. So.
Yeah, I think,
Again, I'm happy to help set up that, you know. The most obvious thing to me is that hotels are where.
One thing the Ritz used to do that I used to be very impressed with, they used to offer shuttle evening for for their people to stay in there. If you want to go to Almonds and have dinner, we'll drop you off. You text when you're ready to get out, we'll come pick you up. That's gone. After the pandemic, we just eliminate that. And that's another thing that I think we need to think about. The hotel needs to, the hotel or maybe the city needs to have some sort of
Alternative transportation.
transportation, a
Mhm.
trolley, a bus, not a bus, but I drive my customers. back
Maybe
to the
golf
Ritz.
carts
They're
when
done. I do.
it's nice and
I take
warm.
about 3, 4 people back to the Ritz. Every night I work voluntarily, not, they're waiting for an Uber. I said, hang up that phone. You don't need the Uber. I got you. I just flip my car on and just take them back. And that's like, I look at the bellmans and all these valet guys standing like, in stack. And it's like, what are you guys doing here? You should be driving your customer back and forth. That's impressive when you go to New York, when you go to Chicago, I mean, they have that kind of service. So.
Yeah. No, I agree. And historically, we have looked at trolleys now in Clayton, I think 2 or 3 times. It is just a wildly expensive proposition when you get in.
Trolley is expensive, and you don't need to deal with the trolley.
We also looked at the e-cars or something that would circle around. It never took hold, for whatever reason.
That was right before, we were trying to get
Hotel.
CCF
I would-
to sponsor.
I would say
Right.
2 vans would cover the whole hotel problem. Like those nice seating vans,
Well, I wholeheartedly agree. It's a great investment for the
No,
hotels.
and as soon as you know where to call to get a ride after my dinner, after my drinking, I drank too much, I want to go to the Meridian. I can't walk 6 blocks. That kind of stuff is very important. Not 6 blocks, but a little
Are you
exaggerated.
rounding up?
Little exaggerated. Another, I wanted to mention something, I might be veering off the subject, stop me if you want to, please. As far as the streets in Clayton, Kathy just mentioned something to me when I walked in here about the lights. We talked about the lights last time.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if we did anything about them. When did you walk with your husband?
Well, that was right after the meeting. We drove around that night or the next.
They
night.
they still go out at 8.
But it seems like some of the lights have been replaced. For a lot of burnt out lights.
What lights are you talking about, Almer?
The street light.
Brentwood, how do you go home? Brentwood? Yeah, they're still out. I haven't seen it the last couple of days, but a week ago, they were still going out at 8 o'clock.
By Ivy.
But Ivy,
It's pitch black at night, yeah.
I
It's
mean-
definitely not inviting, anybody to walk around or.
Well, I mean,
be in the area.
we need to know.
Yeah, but that shouldn't be happening. I'll
Yeah.
check with Public Works. They were looking into that after it was brought up at the
you
last
you
meeting, but
you have a lot of lights that.
but they should be on. I think there's gotta be some kind of problem with their actual timing on that. It's not the fixtures
My
themselves.
vision
It's
is
either
great.
the circuits
I
or the
wanna
timing.
walk everywhere in the middle of the night and not have to worry about it.
Well, I think that's the intention.
Yeah.
We're having some kind of technical issue.
Yeah,
with
and if
it.
that's, yeah,
And it may be that they're checking during the day because a bunch of them were burnt out. And why are some pink and some?
Yeah.
It's driving me
Kathy,
nuts.
you are picky. Just don't worry about it. It's light, as long as.
so it's the type of light that's actually in there. We started with high pressure sodium, and that's the pink to orange kind of hue that you see there. Over time, as we've replaced those bulbs, we go back in with LEDs, and that's when that color changes on those. So they'll all be to LED soon enough here, because you can't get the high pressure sodium anymore. But there hasn't been money budgeted to do a wholesale change and just switch them all out, so
How,
we're just doing it through attrition right now.
It's good to ask.
Good
That's
pressure
a
off
good
gas.
question.
how hard is it to put music in the street,
Exceptionally.
on the streets?
Yeah, we don't have electrical, conduit in the sidewalks.
When you walk down when you walk down right on, Maryland Avenue in the West End, Central West End,
Yes.
they got these speakers in the ground. They very subtle music.
Yes.
It takes off all the car noise, all the wishy-washy, all the talk from the bars, whatever. And that, to me, honestly, is very attractive. It's not loud music. It's just a subtle music, whether it's Sinatra, whether it's whatever, and you sit outside and it's very soft. It's not, you can barely hear it, but it takes off the noise for the street.
Yeah, we don't have, there's not the infrastructure in the sidewalk to allow for that. I mean, we don't have power in the
Sorry,
sidewalk.
sorry, Alex. I know you're disappointed.
The people who live across the street from you probably would have some difficulty with the music.
I'm not talking about that kind of
Be
music.
pretty quiet.
Not
Yeah, I
talking
think he's
about-
talking about
not
really.
talking
Like
quiet,
classical
yeah.
music or
Like a
something.
very is soft.
Robert will be picking out rock and roll music. I don't know what to.
I'm not talking, I was talking about city control music. I'm not talking about Robert or Alex Berger playing the hippie music.
Okay.
That's the only kind of music that matters. Anyway.
Can I add one more thing, suggestion? And so I'll know everybody more. I like your events schedule. When you look at the Cardinals opener and you look at the Blues and all that, you think the City of Clayton can do something festive for those opening days, such as flags on the
Great
on the
idea.
on the street, on the lights or something, to represent that we're having Cardinal Open this week.
Or a viewing party like in Shaw Park.
I like that.
Or,
Use banners or flags or something on the poles, on the lights. Represent the Cardinals, represent the Blues, the soccer team.
Yeah, more festive.
And I think with Carter creativity, he can get him to sponsor these events. They have a lot of money to spend on advertising and sponsorship. You can get the Cardinals to make those beautiful banners that they put downtown with the arches and have them hang them on all the lights in the streets. When you
Yeah,
walk
that would
around,
be
we
amazing.
have an event.
I think San Luis City would actually pay for the
Oh, yeah.
opening of the season. Of course, it's in 2 weeks, but I think,
Blues will do it.
They have lots
The
of
Blues
stuff.
will do it. SLU will play. It's a basketball team. Now they're becoming, yeah.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree, Amr. This year marked the end of all those events, sports specific. They were daytime events meant to host for the office people to come to the city hall for lunch. It evolved in something to not being that. So we did have to end it, but going to my next slide, moving forward, these 4 points here are taken from the ordinance that created this body here. And so these are really, I think, what the city council is asking this group to do. So discussions like, what are we doing the right events? Do you have recommendations for different events? Or, if you want to talk about possibly the banner things or the promotion with the other sports teams, I think that's, a discussion that we can have in the future moving forward. We just need to take, what we've been asked to do and incorporate these thoughts into that.
Can I ask about the baseball, the opening day, the line for the hot dogs and stuff at the fire station, wasn't that the opening day party?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And
Why was it canceled?
well, it was originally intended to engage office employees to come out of the office onto the street and perhaps experience other things as they're walking there for their free hot dog. In all honesty, what we had happening in the last couple of years is we had various groups bust in from other parts of the county, and which is fine, but that wasn't the intent of the event. So we had missed our mark on execution versus intent. So that's why it ended.
You're not doing that anymore, right?
No. I mean, that's not to say we won't do it again in the future, but that iteration of that event with that had run its course. And, I think with the change during the pandemic, that was a much different event prior to the pandemic than it was after the event. So
it could have been a great event if you do it like a street blockage for the future with the Cardinal opening. You don't have to give anything away. If you have memorabilia, shirts, hats, whatever, and you block like Central or Merrimack down.
Yeah, I mean, which leads me to another discussion is that for those of you that follow what the city's doing, there is a movement underway for the renovation of the Shaw Park ice rink space too. And hopefully that will come to fruition here in the near future, which gives us a new dynamic in doing events, especially like a viewing party for opening day and stuff like that, without necessarily impacting the streets all the time, because a lot of the expense of these events is just the street closure themselves. Because we have to have public works staff and police staff here to make those closures happen. And as you know, we do a lot of events in Clayton, like the art fair and all these events that I've listed previously. And these are the same handful of people working them all the time, on top of working such things as tornado response and snow removal. And so we have to be very cautious about fatigue.
Gary, let me ask you a question regarding the budget. So given that we are at capacity right now and there's really not any extra money to spend without being reallocated, is there any chance, or has the city ever discussed possibly taking the personnel and moving that to a different budget?
I mean, I think no. I mean, we haven't, but I think if there are, because quite honestly, we have totally restructured this group, right? I mean, it used to be that once a year, the group would come together, evaluate events, and it was kind of like, okay, that looks great. People would ask some questions. So the idea with this group was to get people who are, working in downtown, running businesses every day, residents who are really interested in walking around, perhaps to give us some guidance. I don't want to speak for Kami and Susan, but I think that the council would certainly be open to a reallocation of some funds. I mean, I will tell you that our budget is very tight. So moving all of personnel, I think would certainly be impossible in the next year or two, until we can figure out another revenue source.
Okay.
But thinking about $20,000, 30, sum of money, like if you wanted, everybody keeps talking about lights. Like if there's a way to really think about lights to make it look like there's some vibrancy, whether it's on Brentwood, whether it's on Merrimack, think about something like that. That's not going to cost $100,000. You know what I mean? Like if there are really identifiable improvements that you think would make a big difference, I would think the city council would be open to that,
Okay.
So, and I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's,
If I can add to- if I can add to that, since before I was on the board, it comes up all the time from the board, from our community, vibrancy. We want people on our streets. How do we get there? And that's the reason for this group. So there's the big idea part, what you're talking about, the big things. What are the issues that are slowing us down? We've got so many good things to offer. So that big thinking is great. And then plugging in, we can afford to do this, we can afford to do that. But I think that if this group comes up with ideas that are hitting on the market, whatever comprehensive plan told us and what we wanted for a long time, then that budget discussion will definitely happen. Because you're right, this is a budget that's already allocated because we've been spending it for a number of years. But the whole idea of this group is to inform that discussion on how this particular budget is spent, which again, then impacts the larger city budget.
Understood.
I mean, everybody keeps talking about parking, like thinking about how we could, I don't know, some small amount of money to allocate to residents for ballet. I don't know. I mean, you guys know better, really.
Parking is
But
definitely an
parking,
issue.
lighting, I mean, that's kind of what as I sit here and listen to all of you, those
Yep.
are a couple of themes that keep coming up.
Parking and lighting, I think, are two of the biggest issues that we face, long term, in terms of vibrancy. I think there's a lot that we can do more short term to help increase vibrancy. And I think Amr has a lot of amazing ideas in that regard. But if we're looking long-term, years out, how are we going to get people to walk on our streets? How are they going to be safe? How is it going to be properly lit? Do we have the proper crosswalks and the right size sidewalks and, that stuff? Do we have the right signage where people even know where they're going if they are walking and they're kind of unfamiliar? Are we branded properly? I think those are the more long-term things that will essentially potentially cost more money that I think we should try to focus on a little bit as a group. And we probably won't have time to this time, but perhaps next month to really try to look at those items. Gary, do you know if that is from the city?
No, it's not.
Sometimes the hotel, they do this on their own.
Yeah, they did this themselves. They
First brochures they come up.
proliferated
Ritz
our
has one,
logo, but
Meridian has one, and the other, the Renaissance place has one too.
May I just point out, and this is just. Hey, St. Louis is gonna host them. I think Clayton should try and get in on that. First of all, a lot of people be staying in. So whether we work with St. Louis City or who, or whether, or find out, who, but I think we should.
Like that.
And I don't know who Clayton, or is it somebody here or whatever. how we get on that.
You have to get in touch with Purina. They're the biggest sponsor out there, and they'll do anything to put their name out. So.
I know we don't have a ton of time, and I do want to make sure that we get through the rest of our agenda items. So one thing I want to make sure that we discuss is a regular meeting schedule. Gary had proposed the fourth Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. Does that work for everyone here?
If I may suggest this, just move it a little later than the 1 p.m. I had to leave a restaurant full of people.
I understand that.
So.
I would be in favor of that.
Morning 10 is fine, or 2 is better.
I'm in favor of 2, if 2 would work for everyone. The fourth Thursday.
it either needs to be in the morning then or about 1:30 because we're gonna have another meeting scheduled at 3 o'clock on this same day.
1:30 is even works,
Is that fine for
because
you?
that lunch would be over, yeah.
Pretty very good.
Everyone in favor of 1:30?
Great.
Okay, and then longer term, once we identify some of these issues and we can come up with something that we can send over to the council to review, perhaps we can, at that point, move to every other month. If everyone's in favor, and we can cross that bridge when we get there.
I have one last question, that might be later, but who decide, and you brought that up last time, where your budget money comes from? That portion that you get for the budget, where does that come from?
You mean the $550,000?
Did you
That
assign
is,
to you?
so this group is funded, the Special Business District is a tax levy on real property.
Oh, okay.
So I'm sure, I don't know how your lease is done, but you potentially may be paying it
I am.
as
but
part of the CAM.
that part I understand, but does the city of Clayton put anything into this group?
No, because the purpose of this group is to make recommendations to the city council on how to spend that money specifically.
I was just thinking of outsourced ideas to increase their budget number without having to tax people more money than they have already.
Yeah, I mean, that's
But,
for this specific type of tax, it's kind of is what it is because, because of the Hancock Amendment, we can't necessarily increase the amount above CPI.
Okay.
So we can't artificially raise the levy to collect more money.
What about the events that you do in the street?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the original question of Julie, that the mayor and the,
Susan.
yes.
Susan, the council.
I'm stuck on that alderman council
Could have anything.
issue. Yeah, I mean, they can contribute general fund money to it, but that was the point I was gonna make earlier when that came up, is that every group that operates under the umbrella of these cities says, well, can't we just get more money for that? And these seven, the council has to, we have finite funds, and so they have to finance, Shaw Park improvements, personnel, fire trucks, street repaving. So, it just, I think they, I don't want to speak for them, but they have to evaluate priorities and needs. We can't live in a house with a holey roof. So, yes, it is theoretically possible they could contribute millions of dollars.
I mean,
Unlikely,
If I
but
can add something to everything, and Kami and Bridget say whatever, but whatever the budget is, when you all come up with ideas and how that is spent, we all have the same goal: give this vibrancy, give the health, the quality, all that kind of stuff. And so even if at the end you come down and and report to the council and give them 4 things to do: fix the lights here, da 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 da. Everything else that's been discussed here, we share. And it informs our thinking on the bigger issues that we're doing and trying to keep the city what our community wants it to be. That answers it. So how the budget goes after that, we may decide to do something out of a general fund or not, but the idea may have come from this group, even if it then doesn't come specifically from the money you're tasked with advising on.
got it.
And there's a lot of overlap in other aspects of what the city does too, because, albeit there may be a lighting issue now with the ones that you and Kathy are noticing are out at night, but we have a lot of missing too, because we had, the way the lamp posts were placed and the materials that they were used, they had to be taken down because they were rusting out and became a hazard. So we do have a lot of missing ones too, but the council has already addressed that with a plan to replace those too. So that aspect of it, excuse me, will come to fruition here in the near future. So, I mean, looking forward, I think the question, Julie, is what do we want to do next and what do we look at? And is there any information that you need from staff in order to help facilitate that? Or are we just talking about events next time, or?
And can I just quickly throw out like another idea out there? I know like when I go through like Webster and Kirkwood, a lot of like their retail areas will have like events that don't actually cost a lot of money, but they're just like, during the holidays, it's like a weekend with Santa and you go to all the shops and at the end you go visit Santa. Or I think in Webster they had, like a mailbox where this is where you could drop your letter to Santa, and it was at their city hall or something. And it's just like, it gets people downtown. It does not have to like cost a ton, but it is really like getting restaurants and retail to kind of like think of different ways during different seasons to get people out. And that just also might be something we want to consider also.
I like that idea a lot. I think another example of a city that does it really well is Kirkwood, with a lot of wine walks and stuff like that. It's very low cost events where it's, each business would sign up and say, hey, I'm willing to do it. And I'm willing to give everybody a 2-ounce pour of wine, and they're walking around with their wine glass, and maybe we, provide a cup that's a city cup or something, or maybe that goes in their $10 or $20 ticket price or something like that. But make people pay, because people love those types of events and they're willing to pay $20 or $25 to go and walk to 10 different spots and just have something different to do on a
Yeah, like people want
Saturday
stuff to
morning.
do. Like every
Totally.
weekend, it's like, what can we do? And with like, we have opportunities here, especially in downtown, it would be like, let's go out and do that.
Yeah, and I feel like it would definitely promote the community aspect more, because I don't feel that aspect so much in downtown Clayton. It's interesting, and I don't know about Amr, but I would not say the majority of my business is from Clayton. Majority is from outside of Clayton. Now,
Well, I didn't say it that way. I said a lot of businesses come through the lunch businesses, dinner businesses comes from, we have our regulars from the community, they all.
Yeah, I mean, same,
Yeah,
but,
regular
but I
lunch.
would say it's at least 50% or more from outside.
It's around there.
Yeah,
Hotels is a big deal, big percentage.
yeah.
That's why I think those neighborhood parties were outstanding.
Yeah.
Ours, that it was,
Yeah.
and people I've never seen. Lucky because we got Taylor Park, but I guess every.
Well, right, to your point, Kathy, I was there also, and they were saying people that lived around there, they don't normally will go, like, we have had the Hanley House before, and they were like, well, it was right in our area. So there were new people there, and they really like that. So yeah, to your point.
Another thing that I don't know if we brought up last time, but I'm curious if the city has had any consideration of bringing back the farmer's market. I felt like that was really popular back when we used to have it.
What was that, Julie? I'm sorry.
The farmer's market.
Yeah, I mean, I think, actually, I got an email about that this morning from somebody. The farmer's market that we had in the Straub's parking lot was, I think it ultimately left because they partnered with the one in U City. Like, we kind of lost our part, the person who kind of
There used
organized
to be
it.
one on the streets, though.
There was, and that was very temporary, which I will say, that was before I was really on the council, and maybe Alex, but the businesses did not like it.
Oh, okay.
Because they lost their parking, so they
Yeah.
they did
I
not
mean-
like that on,
Okay.
on Central.
Right.
So, I mean, I did say, I responded to this person, I don't know, if we do this thing in Shaw Park, I think it'd be really cool to have a pop-up farmer's market, but I don't know how much, people go to Tower Grove, the Boulevard actually has a really nice farmer's market on Sunday mornings. Maybe they would, I don't want to steal it from them, but maybe they would need another home. I don't know. But yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So they don't really, I mean, they're not invested in.
Right.
So I think, I mean, you've got out here, there's no shops out in front of here, have it on this street, but I agree, people really.
It was nice.
Yeah, it was
And
nice.
I think part of the problem, from what I understood from some of the farmers, was that organizing it here. So, that's something, but our growth.
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, I think it's just something to keep considering.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
you may have those city shuttles to help people get around and not have.
I
parking issues.
love the shuttle idea. Let's go.
I think any event you do anywhere in any city, success of the event is the consistency. Now, if you tell me that every Wednesday I'm going to have the farmer market at Shaw Park, and everybody in town knows this, you'll see a lot of planning for it. It get busier and busier and busier. But when you do a farmer market today, this week, and next week, we don't know when.
Yeah.
Cancellations was a lot because five farmers showed up and the rest didn't show up. So it was kind of a little in the unorganized side to me.
I agree with that.
And the farmers were there, they were not happy. Nobody was happy. And if you do it like she said in Shaw Park or anywhere, it doesn't matter where, it has to be consistent. It has to have its own little attraction.
I agree with
With
that.
a little bit of music, a little bit of
Yeah,
playground
this
activities.
is for a larger discussion
Yeah.
maybe next.
Is
I think events is what we need to talk about next time.
I agree. I think what would be nice is potentially if maybe we all agree to come with a couple of small events, that would be great. Low cost events, maybe a mid-range cost event, and then longer term. Because I do think that we have to think long term, where are we in 10 years? Do we have the proper signage? Are people walking on the streets? Or do we still face the same problems of them being super dark and we don't have great wayfinding signage and we still have parking issues? So maybe we could break it out in 3 groups, kind of immediate, budget-friendly options, medium term, long term, and, just propose that and compile them together and discuss from there.
Yeah, so I think there's a logical schedule to this. So, if we'd want to address events next time, because we are in the planning process for FY fiscal year 27, sorry to government speak all the time. next year event plan. So I think now, next meeting would be the time to address events so we can help shape that to a certain extent. And then our budget process will also be starting. Unfortunately, it never ends. So we will be formulating that process. So if this group is going to have some kind of recommendations for the city council as they go into their planning process, you know, that's probably something we need to address in April.
Okay. Okay,
I assume the reserve. I think.
I wouldn't say that, Kathy.
Oh, it would, okay, because I think our idea about having the restaurants and the hotel personnel, I think that before spring, I mean, just when people are really starting to get out, I'd really hate to push that off too long.
It would cost a lot. It just, the city needs to basically do the invitation from Clayton. If I do it as a person, it would be okay. You'll get 25, 30 people at the most, but if Gary does it, all hotels, all restaurant would always want to participate because they want to be part of the business. They want to be part of Clayton. I want to be part of the action. And I think I'd be more than happy to host the first one. And it will cost the city anything. It's just a little invitation or an email or whatever the case might be. And the mingle part is up to the restaurants, the hotels, and all the personnel people to get to know each other. And what are we offering? What does the hotel have in specials? Tell me, what do you do, guys, for certain occupancy? I know that one of the hotels, you can stay there at $60 Monday through Thursday or something like that. And the rest of the week is over $180 or $200.
Oh.
The Ritz-Carlton had a deal like that. The rates now is $1,100 a night. But there's a certain time of the year, of the day, of the week, you can get in there for a couple $100. I mean, these are a lot of information that everybody in Clayton, as a business, doesn't matter what type of business you are, should be involved in.
I just want to back up to your comment about the reserve fund. I was speaking in future planning processes because the way the city operates is we are operating with this year's budget. That doesn't mean that we couldn't do a budget adjustment, but to do something like that next month, we would have to go to city council to get that adjusted. But for planning purposes, like next year, you know, if we come up with an event plan and we're spending more than that 550, but we want to try an event and you want to make that recommendation to the city council, we could plan on spending that reserve amount. Sorry, I just wanted to make that clear.
Thank you.
okay, so we're all in agreement that we're going to come next week with our event ideas. And we can compile those and just have an open discussion regarding the events.
Yes.
Okay,
Is the next meeting, what day is the next meeting?
So it will be the fourth Thursday at 1:30 next month.
26th, I think.
Okay.
1:30. Okay.
It is spring
No,
break.
it's not spring
Okay.
break, no. David and I have, I mean, I may, just depending on, we have a standing tornado meeting on Thursdays at 2:00. That's why David left. So we just might, you know, depending on if there's anything hot to discuss with FEMA or something, we may have to step out or something. So, yeah,
Okay.
but that's not a big.
Does anyone have anything else to add before we close out the day? Awesome. Okay. Thank you all so much. We will see you. I will be. I'm saying, look out.